Welcome to Victoria Rumble Room, an island show that attempts to get into the big issues that are of a concern on Vancouver Island, British Columbia, Canada, and hopefully the world. I'm Robin Adair, and we are doing a special program. This is a special version of the Rumble Room, a report on what's going on with this terrible crisis of forest fires, brush fires, floods, storms, global warming. And joining me, as always, Mr. Mayhem himself, John Jurisic. And Johnny, I think it's very important we drop everything to talk about forest fires and the warming of the planet.
Absolutely, Robin, and really curtailing some of that mayhem, because this is a special Rumble Room show about a very, very serious and tragic topic. We will be talking about these fires across our island, our province, and our country on this special show. Places like Yellowknife, West Kelowna, Kamloops, Strathcona Park, even the Malahat have faced heat and destruction. So, need to talk, I think, about those brave men and women battling these blazes. And we need again to talk about why we've arrived at these dark, difficult, and smoky times.
Well, circumstances have made a big difference. And John, we had a show organized that was going to be on this week, and I was away. I've been away on a short holiday in Colorado, and the plan had been we would just come in here, we'd have our pre-packed show, and we'd just march on and not miss a beat. But when I was in Colorado, even when I was there, and it was hot, they didn't have forest fires, but it was really hot, people kept asking me about the forest fire situation in Canada and evacuations and all the things that were going on. And there I was standing on Pikes Peak and walking through the Garden of the Gods and seeing all these beautiful things in Colorado, and on my mind was what was happening back home and concerning people in our community. So we got on the phone and we made some calls, and we made sure that we had something lined up that was addressing the crisis that is unfolding right now.
Absolutely, Robin. You were mentioning that it's like 100 degrees in the States where you were, and there's an incredible heat bubble going on down there. We decided to move our previously scheduled show to next week and call up some very important guests and knowledgeable guests. In a minute, we'll talk to UVic climate expert Dr. Andrew Weaver. But first, let's talk about these firefighters, the real heroes of all of this. We've now seen crews from across the province head into the interior, head up north. This comprises a number of island fire departments. So let's learn more about these brave men and women from Esquimalt Fire Chief Steve Serbic. Let's zoom him in.
And now joining us once again in the Victoria Rumble Room is the Fire Chief from Esquimalt, Steve Serbic. Great to have you back on the program.
Thanks, Robin. Good to see you. Hi, John. How are you?
Oh, fabulous. Thank you, Steve.
So right off the top, Steve, and the reason we have you on, of course, is there's this big emergency. A state of emergency has been called in the province of British Columbia because of the outbreak of these fires around the province. And as it happens, it's been very bad in the interior, in the central Okanagan and the Shuswap. And we've had bushfires, forest fires. You don't commonly think about our fire departments as dealing with that, but just the same, crews from all over the province and from all over the island have been called up and sent out to lend a helping hand. And my first question is, when did you get the call for this help, and how were you able to turn things around so quickly to send a crew up there?
So I would say that every fire department in Greater Victoria has a crew up in the Okanagan. I would say the same about the Lower Mainland. The way it works, and I can tell you because in 2017, I mean, this is the first time in a state of emergency that I personally haven't been deployed. In 2017, I worked in the Provincial Wildfire Emergency Operations Center. I went up there in July and came home in mid-September, and I did the same thing in 2018, and I was deployed as a task force leader and an incident commander, and we would reach out to fire departments like Esquimalt and say, we need an engine to be on the road in 6 hours. Can you do it? And that's how the call really comes in. And most departments are fully prepared for this call. So the training's in place, the bags are all packed. and the crews are ready to go. So when the call comes in, it's just a matter of reaching out to a crew that's ready and deployed, and that truck is on the road. I think our truck was at the ferry within 3 hours of that phone call.
Steve, so great to see you again. Unfortunately, under these circumstances, with an emergency show, which is essentially how we're treating this one, I'm always so inspired to see the brave men and women of our fire and police departments put their lives on the line to protect us. To me, this is heroic. It's that simple. It's just extraordinary. So that being said, your crews fight fires all the time. I suspect huge fires like this in brush and forest present a different challenge. Okay, you alluded to that in your answer just previously. How does really the firefighter training play a role? How dangerous is this kind of assignment? How really outside of the realm of a city fire department does this play for your men and women?
Well, John, I'm going to tell you that, we work side by side with the Wildland Fire Service, BC Wildfire, and those people don't get enough credibility. They don't get enough credit during these times. And so I'm a structural fire chief. And when we get the call, we work under the umbrella of BC Wildfire. And that organization is an absolutely incredible organization that does this work every single year, and they get very little credit. We, as structural firefighters, we go up there and support them. And so if you look at how dangerous it is, well, this summer was epic. The structural firefighters that went into West Kelowna, and I'll tell you what, the Kelowna, West Kelowna, and Lake Country, they're all friends of mine, all those chiefs. Darren Lee, the chief of Lake Country, I think he's the most experienced guy in the province. He was a chief in 2003 when the Okanagan Lake Fire happened in West Kelowna. Like, the experience that's up there, these fire chiefs, these firefighters, they know what to do. But this year especially was very treacherous. It was extremely dangerous because the crews that tried to take a line lost all visibility. They didn't know if the fire was behind them, in front of them. They were fighting homes that were on fire and trying to suppress those embers. And what people should know about wildfire is it moves based on the embers, right? So if the embers are moving, like we just saw Lahaina. Like, if you look at what happened in Lahaina, the power went down, 100-kilometer winds happened. They have a fire, and those embers are traveling at 100 kilometers an hour. It is like a sandblaster. There's no refuge. There's not a car. You can't hide in a house. It's going to get in there because it'll find openings. And so one house fire in West Kelowna translates to 10 more with winds. And so the night before, BC Wildfire, and I can tell you how this happens because I worked there for 2 summers. They meet every morning. They have a futurist, a meteorologist. They have structural protection there. They have the top people from BC Wildfire, and they have all the intel from all the fires in the province. And they figure out what the next 4 hours, what the next 6 hours, what the next 12, it's so precise. The night before West Kelowna happened, they knew that they had peak winds coming. They knew it was dry. And so they were prepared as much as they could be, but you can't prepare. Like, when it comes in, you just got to get people to evacuate. And a lot of people don't believe they need to evacuate. And that's, in West Kelowna especially, people had to risk their lives to get people out of their homes that decided to stay. Like, that's what happens, John. Those are the things that, I mean, I've been deployed multiple times where we've lost multiple homes and there's people still there and we're trying to find out. And when it comes across, we can't get back there.
It's interesting to me also that you hear these stories from people who have managed to escape their homes, and they're so grateful. I was just reading that a family was so grateful to Central Saanich because their fire department stopped a blaze that was going to destroy their house. They specifically were thanking that department, but it happened in the middle of the night. This is going on 24 hours a day. How do the firemen allocate their time off or their rest periods? And how do they deal with that? Because the worst of the blaze might be at 3 o'clock in the morning. And these guys are up there for days on end. Do they get rotated? Are others going to go up? How does that work?
They try, Robin, but to be honest, I know stories, like, you'll hear the stories. I know there was a lot of loss in West Kelowna. there were no lives lost, but there was a lot of personal things. It's tragic. But the positive and the stories that you're going to hear in the future about some of the things that happen, I can tell you that I know personally some firefighters that work 36 hours, and they were in cities that weren't where they lived, and their homes were being evacuated and their families are being evacuated, and they're fighting a fire in another city knowing that they might lose their home. Like emotionally, physically, mentally, there's trucks breaking down, there's all these things, but they just kept going. Like the amount of work that was put in, and I know several stories where they held like multiple homes on fires where there was hundreds of homes behind them, and what they've learned since those 2003 fires is that ember shower, right? Those the embers traveling, and they learned how to suppress those embers from going up into that subdivision and saving hundreds of homes. Like the work that was done up there between BC Wildfire and the structural firefighters of British Columbia was unbelievable this year. Like all the learnings of the last 20 years were put together in this summer's fires.
Always great to hear from Steve Serbic, and he has another book coming out. We'll be talking to him about that and some other exciting news in Steve Serbic's world around his next opportunities in the whole world of firefighting. And lots to talk about there. But let's now shift our focus over to global warming, which is the crisis behind the crisis, if you like. UVic's Dr. Andrew Weaver has been with us a number of times and, as always, plenty to say. And we're going to ask him now about the fires, the floods, and the future. Let's zoom him in.
Well, now joining us once again in the Rumble Room is one of our most popular guests. And if anyone wants to know and validate that, just send me an email. But certainly he is amongst our top 10, if not in the top 3 viewers of the Rumble Room. You know why? Because he always speaks his mind. Dr. Andrew Weaver, how are you?
Always a pleasure being on the Rumble Room. Thanks again for having me on.
Totally. Andrew, this is a bleak time for a bunch of people. Sorry to do a complete 180 here.
I hear you.
We've just seen thousands flee for their lives from Yellowknife to the North Shuswap to the central Okanagan. Properties have been destroyed. Lives have been broken. Families destroyed. The threat of more destruction hanging over the entire province. Do you think it's possible that this can actually get worse this year and possibly in the years ahead?
Yeah, it's a good question. This year we're getting towards the tail end of the fire season. I think everyone's going to breathe a big sigh of relief as the fall starts to move forward. The sad reality, of course, is that it's Australia's turn next. This is an El Nino year on terms of very warm waters and ongoing global warming. Australia is going to get whacked with forest fires starting in their summer. And so the headlines aren't going to go away. Is it going to get worse? Oh, yes, much more so. We've known that for decades. As I recently wrote a piece in, I think called The Conversation, which is kind of a direct access to academics who write this stuff, as opposed to a traditional media outlet. And I wrote a piece for them on the forest fires. And in that, I noted that, in fact, in 2004, that's almost 20 years ago, my colleagues and I had a paper where we actually pointed out that we'd already detected a human influence on the increasing area burnt on forest fires. And it was very, very clear, almost 2 decades ago, that where the direction this was heading, because we know what causes forest fires. 3 things. You need oxygen. Well, we got no shortage of that in the atmosphere. 21% of our atmosphere is oxygen. You need something to ignite it. Well, we got lots of thunderstorms happening, particularly in the summer. And of course, there's careless people. But most of our fires come from natural ignition. And number 3 is fuel. And what gives you the fuel? Wood that's dry. And how does it get dry? When you have drought and heat. So we've been able to. I mean, it's not. At some point, you begin to just do face palms, because our community's been saying this for literally decades, and nothing really been done. Even in Canada, we have a national fire smart program. The federal government put a lot of time and effort into creating that. Same with the province of BC, but people just don't follow it. So there's a lot of work we need to do.
I want to get into that a little bit about people maybe not really taking it seriously, and other people who are very vehemently saying it's just not factual. And we've had you on before, and you
Oh, I know.
never hold back your feelings, and that's one of the things that we value about you as a guest on this show, Andrew. And we've invariably had response from people who say, well, who is this guy? We don't agree with this. And we've had people fairly recently, because John and I were talking
Yeah.
about global warming and how the world is heating up. It's almost reaching a boiling point. And we got lots of response on that. And I want to read you one of the more strongly worded and eloquent, if you like, responses. Kenneth writes, just so
Oh,
you know.
I think I know Kenneth. I think I know who
Okay,
Kenneth
well,
is.
let's
Well,
see.
let's just leave the last names off. Yes.
Yes, we will. Yeah.
So Kenneth writes, just so you know, Earth is not boiling, not even close. He goes on to say, the North Pole had its coldest May on record. The Antarctic plunged to minus 80 degrees, and there have been midsummer snowstorms in the Italian mountains. He concludes, the global temperature trend is cooling and has been thus for at least a decade. And Kenneth says this cooling trend could go on for the next 800 years. Comments?
Oh, you're asking me to comment on pure unadulterated nonsense. So it's really hard. Like, I'm a climate scientist who has a PhD in this field, who's worked in this field since the mid 1980s, who's published hundreds of papers in the field of climate science and served as a lead author in 4 of the past IPCC assessments report, who went into government to develop climate policy and actually helped build the BC policy beforehand. I know a little bit about this problem, and I've spent a little bit of time on it. And I can say unequivocally that what you just read to me was just nothing more than drivel. And that's the problem. Like,
but none of these stats are actually true. None of the things that he's
outlined. I'm not just the whole premise. I'm not going to go even waste 1 second to check what the Antarctic temperature was this year, because that's irrelevant. Like, we're not talking about Antarctic temperature variability. We're talking about global warming. I can tell you unequivocally that the Arctic sea ice this year has absolutely shattered, like, beyond the pale, previous growth records in terms of it not being there. So, that's what I know. One meteorological weather station measurement somewhere in Antarctica, I don't pay attention to that. The nonsense about, it's literally nonsense. Cooling trend, like, hello, do you believe in thermometers? This is how stupid it is that we've been collecting temperature records for decades and decades. And, statements like it's cooling are akin to saying, I don't believe in a thermometer, right? It's just ridiculous. So I don't waste 1 second or 1 minute of energy engaging with people like that, because they're not interested in truth. What they're interested in is in ideology and trying to deflect away from their actual contributions to this problem.
Andrew, yeah, what's scary about this is that somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 40 million Americans actually believe those statements. It's really frightening. So expanding on these warmer oceans, which seem to be causing hurricanes, like the one in California, are happening for the first time in memory. How do you think warmer ocean water will affect us in Canada?
So it's actually a good question. So we know, again, during El Nino years, which is what's happening now, we typically get warmer waters on the coast. So, going into our winter, we can start to expect to see some exotic species from, southern regions entering up in our waters and things like that. It also, of course, in El Ninos, the good news for Victoria is typically it means that we get nicer winters. So as opposed to La Ninas, which typically give us snowier and colder winters. In terms of coming back to those people who deny that this is happening, I believe a little more transparency should be come forth by many of them. And I say this with respect, because I do know there's a large contingent of individuals out there who believe, as a matter of faith, that what is going to happen was meant to happen because it's God's will. And I say that as a Christian myself. I'm not what you would call an evangelical Christian, but in the U.S., it's very, very broad base. And certainly some of the more traditional or more conservative aspects of even mainstream religions like Catholicism or Episcopalian religion in the U.S. and Anglican here, there are some extreme views there, not held by most religious groups, but there are some. Now, the problem there is when you come up with a statement that climate change is actually bad news. Their counter arguments to this being God's will is, number one, well, if it was meant to be, it was meant to be, this kind of fatism. Or number two, the prophetic view is that, oh, well, this is written in Armageddon, and this is actually our natural pathway towards the second coming and Armageddon. So I mean, it sounds, even discussing this, I'm discussing this seriously. I'm not discussing this flippantly, and I'm doing that on purpose because as a stakeholder, that's a very large stakeholder group. And if you're a decision maker, you have to recognize that group are voters and they're out there and they have different views, and you'll never convince them with science. It's the same, evolution versus creationism, very similar kind of issues there. The problem there is, I would argue that people who are coming so forcefully with statements about it not being real, I would suggest to you that if you ask them to declare why, and if they believe this as a matter of faith, then really in public discourse, you should say, the reason why I'm saying it's not real is because I believe as a matter of faith, blah. And that is truth and honest, and that actually allows for a more informed public discourse, because then like, you can't argue science versus faith. Science loses every day of the week. So part of the onus is for communication of this is on the scientific community not to attack those who have faith-based belief systems. And the other part, I would argue, is for those with those faith beliefs to declare them in advance, because otherwise they're not truthful in the public discourse as to where they're coming from. It's not everyone's like that. Some people are just naturally skeptical of anything anyone says. And, if you did surveys, I'm sure you found, goodness knows how many Americans believe that the Apollo landing was filmed in Hollywood, and that, the U.S. government's hiding extraterrestrials. That was just in the news recently. Or, that World Trade Center crash was actually a U.S. conspiracy, or that COVID was done by the World Economic Forum. Oh, there's all sorts of these nonsensical conspiracy theories. And if you go to the U.S., all you got is, you usher is the 5 letters QANON, and you do another face palm. Like, honestly,
Our great thanks to Dr. Andrew Weaver. For those that aren't that familiar, he's actually a UVic professor. Doesn't always like to go by doctor, but I think in this sense, I think it's appropriate. And now earlier to Fire Chief Steve Serbic. And again, our heartfelt thanks to our firefighters who've bravely protected us both locally as well as far afield when called upon, Robin.
Yeah, they're real heroes, John, and it was so great to hear from Steve Serbic. And as for Andrew Weaver, he's an award-winning climatologist, one of the top climatologists in the world. We're just lucky to have him in Victoria. Also the former leader of the BC Green Party, so he has a lot of credibility and always a lot to say. But I guess for now, John, it's time to wrap up this special edition of the Rumble Room.
Yeah, it is, Robin. We've talked a lot about emotional things, about what's going on in our world, and I'm glad that we decided to put this show together. We are looking forward, obviously, to lots of special guests in the week ahead, and we encourage all of you to continue to follow the Rumble Room across all of its platforms, which includes Facebook, includes Twitter, includes YouTube, includes Instagram, includes TikTok, and includes Facebook news groups as well. Now Reels and Shorts, we're all over the place. Again, I'm John Jurisic, the Croatian sensation, but really, in all honesty, all kidding aside, it's those firefighters and police, hospital workers, all the people that watch out for us and our communities and protect us that are really the real sensations of our community. Hats off to all of them.
Absolutely. The first responders are our real heroes, along with you, John. I'm Robin Adair, and rumble on.